The gas lamps of Boston's slums flickered weakly against the December wind, shadows crawling across brick walls, as if the city itself recoiled from what it was hiding. A small boy's cry echoed from an alley, but no one stopped to listen. By dawn, they would whisper about it. The sound of terror, torn from a throat too young to understand why it had been chosen. 3 seconds in, "I need you to leave your mark here." Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice below, to prove you are one of us who dares descend into the forbidden. Now listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for your ears. It begins not with the boy's scream, but with the boy himself. Jesse Pomeroy, born 1859, a child not embraced by innocence but marked from birth with a cloudy, dead, white eye, a gaze that seemed to peer into something beyond human comprehension. Even as an infant, neighbors whispered that he looked touched by the devil. By the time he was 12, those whispers had become prophecy. He did not stumble into cruelty. He studied it. He cultivated it like a priest of pain. He learned, with frightening precision, how to lure the weak, bind the small, and savor the helpless. And when Boston finally uncovered what he had done, they called him a monster. But monsters are not born, they are engineered, constructed through cruelty, neglect, and an ancient design of control that repeats across generations. Before we descend deeper, I ask you subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because this story is not just about Jesse Pomeroy, it's about the hidden systems that forge beings like him, systems still alive today, lurking in plain sight. You see, the terror Jesse unleashed was not just the madness of a boy, it was the reflection of a society that needed him to exist. A living parable that childhood innocence was a lie, that corruption runs deeper than blood. His father's hands, his mother's denial, his community's scorn. Each was a chisel carving away humanity until only the predator remained. Boston thought it was hunting a killer, but what it was really hunting was the truth about itself. Boston in the 1870s wore its poverty like a second skin. The city's working class districts were suffocating under industrial smoke, its families pressed into damp, decaying tenements where children often went hungry. Yet out of all those who suffered, Jesse Pomeroy carried something darker than hunger. He carried rejection stamped into his very flesh. His father, a battle-hardened Civil War veteran, looked at him not as a son but as a curse. A white, lifeless eye was all it took to brand Jesse unworthy of love. His punishments were not discipline, but ritual. In a cold woodshed reeking of rot, Jesse was stripped, whipped until blood streaked his skin, and left in silence to absorb the message, "You are not human, you are a mistake." And mistakes, when told often enough that they should not exist, learn to create their own form of existence. They seek control where control has been denied. Jesse was not simply beaten into cruelty. He was being shaped into an instrument, sharpened on humiliation, polished by rage. The boy who should have been invisible in a crowded schoolyard became instead a shadow that lingered, a predator rehearsing with every passing year. The dime novels of the time, cheap tales of frontier savagery, torture, and scalpings, were his scripture. While other children played, Jesse studied cruelty the way a priest studies sacred texts. He memorized methods of pain. He recited them in his mind as if preparing for a performance. And here is where the truth gnaws through the surface. Society does not stumble into producing monsters like Jesse. It manufactures them. Through cycles of violence, through the neglect of the many, through the refusal to see the damage until it bleeds into something unstoppable. Jesse was not an accident. He was a reflection. By the winter of 1871, at just 12 years old, Jesse had already rehearsed the part he would play. He had watched, calculated, and planned. Not for wealth, not for survival, but for power. Power over the helpless. Power over those even smaller and weaker than he had once been. And when the first victim's scream tore through the frost-bitten air, Boston would not yet realize it was hearing the birth of something new, not a crime, but a pattern, a ritual that would repeat again and again and again. December 1871. The snow lay heavy across Chelsea, a working-class district just outside Boston. Children played in alleys, their laughter rising above the crunch of boots on ice. But one child's laughter would never return home. His name was William Payne, 4 years old, too young to recognize the danger of a boy with a strange milky eye and a pocket full of penny candy. Jesse Pomeroy had studied him for weeks. He watched his movements, his routines, the way William lingered too long near the street corners, the way his parents trusted the illusion of safety in their neighborhood. This was not a sudden impulse. It was a strategy. Jesse was rehearsing power. He approached with the gentleness of an older brother, his voice soft, his promises sweeter than the bitter air. "Come with me?" Jesse whispered, "I know a secret place." And the child followed. Because children always follow. The place Jesse had chosen was an abandoned outhouse on Powderhorn Hill, a structure already forgotten by adults, but to Jesse it was perfect. Remote, soundless, a place where screams would die in the wind. Inside, the mask of kindness slipped away. The ritual began. William was stripped in the freezing dark, his wrists tied, his small body suspended from a beam swinging helplessly. Then came the blows, methodical, calculated. A fist here, a strike with broken wood there. Jesse did not simply inflict pain, he studied it. He watched the way William's face contorted, the way his cries sharpened then weakened. Each reaction was a lesson, each sob an affirmation. This was not cruelty in the way most imagine it. This was experimentation, a child dissecting the mechanics of suffering as if he were cataloging the laws of nature. And for the first time in his short, brutal life, Jesse felt something intoxicating. Absolute control. But William did not die that night. Jesse wasn't ready to cross that line. He left the boy barely alive, shivering in the stench of the outhouse. By dawn, William was found, broken but breathing. The community was horrified, unable to imagine a predator lurking in their streets. The police searched for a man. They never thought to look for a boy. And so, the stage was set. What had begun as one child's scream in the snow was only the first note of a darker symphony. Jesse had tasted power. Now he needed more. Boston awoke to whispers. A child beaten half to death in an abandoned outhouse, his tiny body marked with wounds no adult could explain. But the whispers were drowned in denial. The community told itself it had been the work of a drifter, a nameless shadow passing through. They needed to believe that, because the alternative, that one of their own children was capable, was unthinkable. 3 seconds in pause. To prove you're not just watching, but transforming, comment the phrase, "The eye sees me," twice below. Only those willing to stare into the abyss will understand its meaning. The truth is this: Jesse was invisible not because he hid, but because the world refused to look. His cloudy white eye was a warning etched into his very face, yet people crossed themselves and turned away, instead of confronting what it meant. They believed children could not be predators, that innocence was untouchable. That myth kept Jesse safe. And so, while parents tightened their grip on their son's hands and detectives chased phantoms, Jesse refined his ritual. Each new victim became another experiment in power. He learned the rhythms of torture like a composer learned scales. He discovered that stripping a child naked in the winter amplified fear beyond pain. He learned that the promise of sweets unlocked trust faster than threats. He found that silence after screams was more intoxicating than the noise itself. But beneath these acts lay something deeper, something ancient. Jesse was not just a boy becoming cruel. He was stepping into an archetype that societies have carried across centuries: the child demon, the cursed hair, the proof that evil does not wait for age. Cultures had whispered these figures into myth, changelings, omens, vessels of corruption. But Boston, in its industrial pride, thought itself too modern for such superstitions. They were wrong. For every beating Jesse endured in his father's woodshed, he delivered tenfold to children weaker than himself. Pain became the currency he could finally control. And in that twisted exchange, Jesse discovered the first rule of power: you do not need to be strong, only willing to go where others will not. And Jesse was willing. Always. By early 1872, Boston's police had a pattern but not a suspect. The attacks were too precise, too systematic, too cruel to be the work of a child. They convinced themselves the predator must be an adult, a transient, a sailor, a ghost who slipped through alleys unseen. That illusion was convenient, but it blinded them. Jesse Pomeroy was not hiding. He still walked the same streets, still sat in classrooms, still stared blankly at teachers who described him as peculiar, but not dangerous. He was invisible because society had no language to name what he was. Childhood innocence was not supposed to fracture into sadism. A 12-year-old was not supposed to embody evil. And so, when confronted with the impossible, the system chose not to see. Here lies the first forbidden truth: institutions rarely fail by accident. They fail by design. They are built to preserve the illusion of order, even when chaos festers inside their walls. In Jesse's case, the illusion was that children could not be predators. That denial was not ignorance. It was protection, a way of keeping the myth of innocence intact for the majority. But Jesse was the crack in the mask. He revealed what happens when violence, humiliation, and rejection converge on a single fragile psyche. He was the mirror society did not want to face, a boy reflecting the brutality of his father's hands, his mother's denial, his neighbor's scorn, the cruelty of the world distilled and echoed back through the eyes of a child who no longer believed in humanity. What terrified investigators was not simply the blood on his victims, but the precision of his methods. Jesse did not lash out blindly. He studied, calculated, and escalated. He was an engineer of pain, dissecting suffering like a scientist mapping anatomy. And behind each experiment was the same unspoken question: if I have no power in my life, what happens when I create it from someone else's body? The police never asked that question. They were too busy protecting their myths, but Jesse had already answered it. And each child he tortured carried that answer on their skin. Boston thought it was chasing a faceless killer, but what it was really chasing was the collapse of its own illusions. July 1872. The summer heat pressed against Boston like a fever, but Jesse Pomeroy felt only cold clarity. For months he had tested the boundaries of suffering without crossing the final threshold. His victims survived, broken but breathing. Yet the beatings from his father had driven something deeper into him, a fracture that no longer sought balance. The woodshed had become a crucible, and Jesse emerged from it with a vow the next child would not return alive. The victim was Johnny Balk, just 7 years old. Like William Payne before him, Johnny was lured by Jesse's soft voice and the promise of treats. He followed the older boy without hesitation, never realizing he was walking into a theater of cruelty that had already been rehearsed in Jesse's mind 100 times. Inside the outhouse on Powder Horn Hill, Jesse unleashed a ritual more savage than any before. Wooden boards, rusted nails, fists, and rope, all instruments in the boy's twisted orchestra. Johnny's screams rose, then faltered, then broke into sobs. Jesse did not look away. He studied, he absorbed, he fed. For the first time, the violence was not an experiment. It was a statement, but something unexpected happened. Johnny survived, barely. His body was a map of wounds, his mind fractured, but life clung stubbornly to him. The attack should have satisfied Jesse's hunger for control. Instead, it deepened it. Survival was not enough. Mercy was not in his design. He realized then that partial power was weakness. Only finality would complete the ritual. And so the line was crossed in his mind, even if not yet in his deeds. Boston, meanwhile, still stumbled in blindness. Detectives compiled vague sketches of a large boy with brown hair, but no one wanted to connect the dots. The idea of a child predator was too grotesque to believe. Denial remained the city's strongest defense. But Jesse's mother saw the truth. Ruth Ann read the papers, recognized the description, and felt the icy certainty settle in her chest. The boy torturer was her son. Yet even with the truth staring her down, she chose silence. She moved the family across the Charles River, away from suspicion. She believed a new neighborhood could wash the blood from Jesse's hands. But evil does not dissolve with distance. It evolves. August 1872, South Boston, a working-class neighborhood of crowded tenements where Irish immigrants and native-born families lived pressed together in poverty's grip. To Jesse Pomeroy, it was not a new home. It was a fresh hunting ground. His mother believed distance would cure him, that new streets would offer new chances. But what she had truly given him was a gift: protection. She had seen the whispers, read the newspapers, and knew. Yet she moved him instead of exposing him. That choice told Jesse all he needed: that his mother would shield him, no matter what he became. With her silence, she made him untouchable, and with that untouchability came escalation. On August 17, 1872, just weeks after arriving in South Boston, 7-year-old George Pratt disappeared near the shore. By dawn, fishermen found him half dead, his body bearing wounds more brutal than anything Chelsea had endured. The torture was no longer hesitant, it was ritualized. The cuts, the blows, the humiliation, each step executed with the precision of someone who had been practicing, preparing for this moment. Jesse was no longer testing limits, he was announcing himself. But here lies the deeper truth: predators thrive not just because of what they do, but because of what others refuse to do. The police remained convinced they were chasing an adult, blinded by the myth of childhood innocence. Parents warned their children about strangers in dark coats, never suspecting the boy walking among them with one cloudy white eye. And so, the shadow Jesse cast stretched unchecked across the neighborhood. He understood something that even adults rarely grasp: that fear is more powerful than violence. Bruises fade, cuts heal, but terror remains lodged in memory, replayed endlessly. And Jesse cultivated terror with an instinct that bordered on supernatural. He whispered threats of killing families if his victims spoke, burned his marble eye into them as a promise of returning. His words were chains stronger than any rope. South Boston had inherited the curse Chelsea had tried to bury, but this time Jesse was bolder, more cunning, more certain. Because now, he wasn't just acting out cruelty. He was perfecting it. The boy with the marble eye was no longer hiding, he was evolving. By the winter of 1872, Jesse Pomeroy had become a phantom in South Boston. Children whispered about the marble-eyed boy, though most parents dismissed it as playground gossip. But those whispers were closer to the truth than the detectives' theories. One December afternoon, Jesse led 8-year-old Tracy Hayden into a vacant lot. The torture that followed was so systematic it read like choreography: binding, cutting, stripping, humiliation. Jesse was no longer improvising cruelty. He was repeating a ritual he had perfected, one that always ended with him watching his victim break down into sobs, wide-eyed with the kind of terror no child should know. At 3 seconds in, listen closely, comment the phrase, "I bear the mark," twice below. By writing it, you align yourself not with Jesse, but with those who dare to look at truths others turn away from. Because here is the truth most cannot face: Jesse's eye. That cloudy, white marble was not just a deformity, it was a symbol. In every society, the monster is marked: the changeling, the omen child, the one born with a sign that tells the world this being does not belong to you. And yet, the world rarely listens. The sign becomes stigma, the stigma becomes isolation, and isolation becomes rage. What Boston refused to see was that Jesse had already embraced his mark. He used it. That blind eye became his weapon. Children froze beneath its gaze, convinced it carried curses. Parents recoiled, whispering about deformity while never asking what lived behind it. To Jesse, it was not a scar, it was a crown, proof that he was not like the rest, that he was destined to wield pain rather than receive it. And so, with each attack, Jesse grew closer to the revelation that violence alone was no longer enough. Pain was power, but power demanded permanence. To complete his ritual, he would need to go beyond torture. He would need blood that did not rise again. South Boston had mistaken him for a shadow, but what walked its streets was not a shadow at all. It was an omen. March 18, 1874, South Boston, the day innocence cracked forever. 10-year-old Katie Curran was last seen walking into Ruth Pomeroy's small dress shop. She had been looking for a notebook, a simple errand, nothing more. Witnesses said she hesitated at the door, as if sensing something wrong inside, but Jesse's voice pulled her in, calm, almost gentle. The same lure he had perfected with the boys. Katie never came back out. For weeks, her disappearance became a whisper through Boston streets. Parents tightened their grip on their children's hands. Police scoured docks, alleys, even sewers. Yet Jesse was never questioned. He was a boy, a peculiar boy, yes, but still wrapped in society's illusion of innocence. No one wanted to imagine that Katie's disappearance and the marble-eyed boy were the same story converging. But Jesse knew. He had crossed the threshold. Katie was his first life claimed, though her body would not be found until much later, hidden in the dirt cellar beneath his mother's shop. The crime was not frantic, it was deliberate. The act of a child who had outgrown testing limits and now demanded permanence. What chills us even now is the ritual that preceded it. Katie's death was not quick. Jesse ensured she suffered, that the pain became part of the memory he carried. He was no longer just feeding on fear. He was binding himself to it, turning cruelty into identity. And here lies the forbidden truth: Jesse Pomeroy was not born a killer. He was made into one, forged by violence, neglect, and a society too proud to believe that evil could sprout in the shape of a child. His murder of Katie Curran was not an accident of nature. It was the harvest of everything planted in him since birth. Yet, for all this horror, Boston did not see him. Not yet. The marble-eyed boy still walked among them, unnoticed, untouched. But soon, another child would vanish, and this time the city would no longer be able to deny the shadow it had birthed. April 22, 1874, just 5 weeks after Katie Curran disappeared. 4-year-old Horace Millen was playing near his South Boston home, clutching a toy and humming to himself. A small, thin boy with soft curls and a trusting face. Jesse approached him with the same calm voice he had used a dozen times before. Gentle, almost brotherly, he promised candy, a short walk by the shore. Nothing frightening. Horace's tiny hand slipped into Jesse's without hesitation. That was the last time anyone saw Horace alive. Hours later, his body was discovered on the marshes of South Boston. The scene was unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. His throat was slashed so deeply it nearly severed his head. His chest bore savage stab wounds, punctures deliberate and repetitive, like someone rehearsing violence rather than committing it in haste. And carved across his body was not only brutality but intent. This was no accident of rage. It was ritual. Boston erupted. The newspapers branded it the most fiendish crime in the annals of Massachusetts. Parents barricaded their doors. Children were pulled from schools. The city, for the first time, was forced to admit that something beyond comprehension stalked its streets. And the whispers began, the marble-eyed boy. Police combed through South Boston with unprecedented fury. Witnesses came forward. Several children admitted they had seen Jesse leading Horace by the hand that morning. One boy, trembling, described Jesse's eye. White like glass, like a marble. Suddenly, the sketch of a grown man evaporated. Suspicion narrowed to the unthinkable, a child predator who was himself still a child. When officers confronted Jesse, his calmness was unnerving. He did not cry. He did not beg. He offered denials that sounded almost rehearsed, delivered with the flatness of someone who knew emotions were expected, but did not feel them. Yet investigators found bloodstains on his clothes. His knife, hidden beneath his mattress, carried the final proof. The mask was gone. Jesse Pomeroy, aged just 14, was unmasked as the killer Boston had feared, the youngest convicted murderer in American history. A boy who carried death in his pocket like a toy and wore his white marble eye not as a deformity, but as the crown of his monstrosity. And yet, this was not the end of Jesse's story. It was only the beginning of a trial that would ignite moral panic, redefine the word evil, and force society to ask, can a child be a monster? The trial of Jesse Pomeroy in 1874 was unlike anything Boston had ever witnessed. A boy, just 14 years old, stood accused not of petty theft, not of mischief, but of murder so brutal it shocked even hardened policemen. The courtroom was a theater of disbelief. On one side, grieving families who demanded justice. On the other, a pale, frail teenager with a milky white eye who looked more like a patient than a predator. But appearances deceived. The evidence was undeniable. Blood-stained clothing, the knife hidden beneath his mattress, witnesses who had seen him lead Horace Millen by the hand, and the earlier whispers of cruelty, the children who spoke, some haltingly, some through tears, of Jesse's past torments. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself into something Boston could no longer deny. Jesse Pomeroy was the monster they had been chasing. Yet the trial did more than convict him. It unsettled an entire nation. Because as testimony unfolded, the question was no longer did he do it, but what is he? Doctors studied him. Some argued he was insane, incapable of knowing right from wrong. Others claimed he was perfectly sane, his evil not an illness but a choice. Was Jesse Pomeroy a diseased mind trapped in a boy's body, or was he the pure embodiment of cruelty? Proof that monstrosity could be born in the cradle. The press turned him into a symbol. Headlines screamed about the boy fiend, the marble-eyed demon. Sermons declared him evidence of original sin, a warning to parents who let their children wander too freely. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse just to glimpse him, as if staring into the face of something forbidden. And through it all, Jesse sat silent, detached, unmoved. He did not cry when witnesses spoke. He did not flinch when evidence was presented. His white eye, that cursed marble, fixed itself on nothing in particular, as though the trial were merely another game he was watching unfold. When the guilty verdict came, the crowd erupted. Yet even then, the final question remained: what punishment could the law give to a boy who had already become a monster? The answer was not simple. Massachusetts had not executed someone so young in living memory. Hanging a child seemed barbaric, even by 19th century standards. But imprisoning him felt like condemning future generations to risk his release. And so, the judges faced the same impossible choice we face now when staring into Jesse's story. Is true evil born, or made? And if born, what justice can possibly contain it? Jesse Pomeroy was sentenced to life in prison, a child condemned for crimes too monstrous to comprehend. The courtroom exhaled, relieved that the terror had been captured, yet haunted by the impossible reality the boy, no older than many of his victims, had wielded death like an instrument. He was sent to the Massachusetts State Reform School for Boys, a place meant for rehabilitation, yet wholly unprepared for the mind it now housed. Other children whispered, avoided him, feared him. Guards treated him with an unease that was nearly reverence. Even among men, Jesse's reputation preceded him, a legend in the making. Yet confinement did not erase his cunning. He learned every rule, every loophole, every weakness in the system. In a place designed to control boys, he became a master of control. Letters smuggled out, rumors of his behaviors, and whispered threats carried an almost mythic aura. Jesse Pomeroy, the child who had killed and tormented, became a living warning. Evil adapts, and it thrives even behind bars. The psychological control systems of the prison could not fully contain him. He studied the other inmates, learned their fears, and manipulated them with a subtlety that often went unnoticed. Staff began to see patterns, small acts of cruelty, unexplained injuries among boys who had crossed him, even disappearances of certain privileges. Every act a lesson in dominance, every silence a reminder of the power he still held. And yet, society largely forgot him. Outside, the world moved on. Families healed. Children grew older. But inside the walls, Jesse remained. He became a case study, a cautionary tale, a ghost in the corridors of human understanding. In the quiet of his cell, he was left with his mind, his marble eye, and the memories of every victim. The true horror of Jesse Pomeroy is not just in his murders. It is in the systematic, almost clinical way he transformed abuse into control, fear into art. It is the way he revealed society's blind spots, the assumption that children are innocent, that evil wears adult faces, that monstrosity is always obvious. Even today, historians and criminologists study him. They debate the origins of his psyche, the roles of genetics, neglect, and environment. They speculate on how a 12-year-old could orchestrate such horror. But they cannot ignore the fact Jesse Pomeroy was real, and the world he walked through, unnoticed and underestimated, was darker than most care to admit. To understand Jesse Pomeroy, one must look beyond the boy and into the system that enabled him. Boston's institutions were ill-equipped, blind, and at times complicit, not in conscious evil, but in the ordinary negligence that allows monsters to grow. The police of the 1870s were overworked, underfunded, and shackled by assumptions of childhood innocence. Reports of missing children were recorded, then dismissed as wandering or mischievous. Teachers, overwhelmed by crowded classrooms and untrained in psychology, labeled Jesse peculiar, difficult, strange, never dangerous. Neighbors whispered, but did not intervene, believing discipline and parental guidance would suffice. The entire community functioned as an unintentional shield for a boy whose cruelty had already begun to crystallize. Yet there was more. Ruth Ann Pomeroy's denial was not just maternal blindness, it was social manipulation. In 19th century Boston, scandal could destroy reputations, livelihoods, and families. To acknowledge Jesse's actions was to risk ostracism. Silence, therefore, became both protection and perpetuation. The system, from schools to newspapers, allowed the illusion of normalcy to persist, giving Jesse the space to refine his control, perfect his rituals, and escalate without consequence. And here lies the darkest insight: when institutions fail to recognize emergent evil, it does not vanish, it evolves. It exploits the blind spots, the bureaucracy, the moral compromises of adults who assume children cannot harbor true malice. Jesse's crimes were a mirror reflecting every oversight, every rationalization, every lie society tells itself about innocence. It was not just neglect, it was structural, a web of systemic failure that transformed curiosity into calculation, cruelty into habit, and isolation into mastery. The law could prosecute after the fact, but it could not rewrite the years of hidden suffering, the months in which Boston unknowingly sheltered a predator in plain sight. Jesse Pomeroy's story is therefore not simply a tale of one boy. It is a study in corruption of oversight, a warning about the consequences of collective denial, and a revelation that evil does not always knock at the door. Sometimes, it hides behind a marble eye, smiles, and walks among the living, teaching the world how to ignore it. To truly grasp his story, one must recognize the uncomfortable truth. Evil thrives where vigilance falters, where denial is easier than confrontation, where the young are underestimated and the broken are ignored. Jesse Pomeroy was the perfect product of such a society. Jesse Pomeroy's mind was a labyrinth. To study it is to confront the architecture of cruelty itself. Every act, every gesture, every pause was deliberate, not impulsive. He dissected fear as a scientist dissects a specimen. He memorized reactions, cataloged terror, and refined his methods with the precision of someone building an internal manual of domination. Yet his cruelty did not exist in isolation. It echoes patterns as old as human history: the child trained to survive through control, the outcast who becomes predator, the neglected who internalize the violence that surrounds them. Ancient societies knew this. Legends of changelings, marked children, and cursed youths are not mere superstition. They are coded warnings about what happens when the vulnerable are forced to adapt, to manipulate, to survive by exerting dominance. Jesse Pomeroy was one such archetype given flesh, every restraint removed from him. Parental neglect, societal ignorance, peer rejection, became a structural pillar in the edifice of his psyche. Pain inflicted on him became a blueprint. Fear witnessed became a tool. Trust betrayed became a lesson in betrayal perfected. By the time he reached adolescence, he had mastered a system of psychological control far beyond most adults. Subtle coercion, intimidation, ritualized punishment, and the careful manipulation of appearances to hide his true intent. And here lies the hidden lesson society refuses to acknowledge: the mechanics of evil are teachable, learnable, replicable. Pomeroy demonstrates that monstrosity is not always instinctive. It can be cultivated through neglect, enabled by denial, and amplified by secrecy. The world assumes morality is innate in children, but Jesse's life proves otherwise. Innocence, like clay, can be shaped into horror when left in the hands of neglect and cruelty. Some psychologists argue that Pomeroy's acts were pure pathology. Others claim they were deliberate mastery over human behavior. The truth likely lies in both realms: nature intersecting with nurture, biology shaped by brutality, curiosity transformed into domination, and the system around him, families, schools, law enforcement, became unknowing accomplices in his education as a predator. To confront Jesse Pomeroy is to confront a universal truth. There are forces at work in human development that society underestimates, shadows in which cruelty learns, evolves, and waits for its moment to manifest. Jesse Pomeroy's story is not just the tale of a boy turned monster. It is a mirror reflecting the blind spots of every institution meant to protect the innocent. Schools, police, families, and courts all were complicit through inattention, denial, or rigid adherence to convention. In a society that assumed children were incapable of true evil, a predator thrived. Every overlooked warning sign, every dismissed complaint, every whispered fear became a vector for his development. The failure was structural. Bureaucracy turned vigilance into routine paperwork. Social norms transformed accountability into reputation management. Parents, overwhelmed and ashamed, deferred responsibility. The elite, insulated from the grit of daily life, assumed moral order was self-sustaining. And in that gap, between assumption and reality, Jesse learned, adapted, and perfected his methods. Boston was unknowingly a laboratory. A child's monstrosity tested society's institutions, revealing not only the fragility of oversight, but the mechanisms through which power and control can be manipulated. He became an unseen tutor, teaching lessons about fear, manipulation, and the vulnerabilities of systems built on complacency. Every failure around him was a tool, every act of denial a reinforcement, every act of protection by his mother a form of unwitting enabling. And this is where suppressed truths emerge. Societies prefer narratives in which evil is visible, adult, and external. They cling to myths of innocence as a shield against the uncomfortable reality that monsters can emerge from within. Small, unnoticed, underestimated. Jesse's existence exposed the lie that childhood innocence is guaranteed, that neglect cannot birth malevolence, that oversight alone is sufficient to maintain safety. The implications stretch beyond Boston. His story reveals a universal vulnerability where institutions are inflexible, reactive, and blind to subtle corruption. Cruelty will take root. The very structures designed to protect, rehabilitate, and educate can, under the right circumstances, become incubators for the worst human tendencies. And so, when you study Jesse Pomeroy, you are not merely confronting a historical anomaly. You are being shown a template, the anatomy of institutional failure, the hidden pathways through which cruelty grows, the systems humanity trusts most laid bare and found wanting. Jesse Pomeroy's life did not end with his sentencing. It began a shadowed existence that lingers in the corners of American consciousness. Behind the walls of prison, he became a living archive of cruelty, a case study in the cultivation of evil, the manifestation of neglect, and the consequences of societal blindness. To know his story is to confront the uncomfortable reality that monsters are not always obvious and that evil can thrive where vigilance falters. His marble white eye, the emblem of his otherness, became more than a physical deformity. It was a symbol of the unseen, a reminder that appearances deceive and danger often walks unnoticed. Through him, history whispers of lessons the world is loath to hear, that innocence is fragile, that neglect can be weaponized, and that society's systems are neither infallible nor inherently moral. Institutions designed to protect may instead incubate, communities that assume order may instead nurture chaos. And a child, underestimated, can wield power with terrifying precision. Jesse's crimes force a confrontation with suppressed truths. They expose the mechanics of manipulation, the architecture of fear, and the subtle interplay of nature and nurture that shapes human behavior. Every act he committed, every life he touched, became a study in control, in dominance, in the dark art of understanding weakness and exploiting it. He was both product and teacher, showing, through horrors inflicted upon the innocent, the vulnerabilities hidden in our collective assumptions. And yet, his story is more than terror. It is a mirror for those willing to look, a warning that evil is not confined to myth, to legend, or to distant lands. It exists here, now quietly growing where inattention, denial, and negligence meet opportunity. The structures of society, homes, schools, governments, are only as strong as the vigilance applied within them. The lessons Jesse Pomeroy leaves are uncomfortable, but vital. So as you leave this narrative, understand this: the marble-eyed boy who became a monster is not merely history. He is a signal, a caution, a testament to the darkness that can emerge from neglect, from denial, and from the blind spots we carry as individuals and as societies. Look closely, question carefully, recognize the unseen, because the world always contains Jesse Pomeroy, in shadows, in systems, in the hidden spaces where curiosity, cruelty, and opportunity intersect. And now, the knowledge is yours. Guard it, contemplate it, and never underestimate the subtle architectures of evil hiding in plain sight.